So welcome back, guys, and now I want to move on to analysing reference. One of the biggest differences between junior or amateur artists and professional artists is their ability to understand a concept. Too often do you see an asset or an image that looks quite like the reference that you're trying to recreate, but you've stopped far too short, too early, before it looks as close as possible to the reference. Now this again, it doesn't need to be exact. It's difficult to translate a whole 2D scene into 3D. But all the most important elements need to be there. The size relationships, the distance between the objects, the shape and the value choices, and the camera angles, etc. Essentially, all the things that we discussed previously. So you would start by finding a concept, or your reference. In this case, this is a really nice one by Rajan and Depu, who kindly let me use this to recreate. And you can see I've tried my best to match his reference as closely as possible. The idea being that he is an artist, he's a 2D artist, and he's a very good one. So all the decisions that he made within the image are there for a reason. So there's no need for me to try and change them if what this is a study or a practice in turning a 2D concept into a 3D image. If we're talking about assets, then it's important to try and analyse every aspect of what it is that you're trying to create in modelling, texturing and shading. Although this comes with practice, knowing which values, settings or tools to best recreate any type of detail, it's the observation that is really the difference between poor and excellent assets. In the end, it becomes almost like a game of spot the difference, right? Constantly asking yourself, does it look like it? Does it really look like it? And not stopping until the answer is as yes as it can be. Now, there are a few universal principles that work here to help us achieve this realism, but from a practical standpoint. So let's look at it from an environment perspective. So big to small, or more appropriately, vague to detailed, is one that I apply everywhere. If not for artistic purposes, then sometimes just for my own sanity. There is often just too much to do and too much to think about to get too lost in the details when you first begin. Concept artists and sculptors are masters at this, but we can apply it to a lot of what we do in environments. First start by analysing the big shapes and making sure that these are as close as possible before moving on. So in this case, it's just taking a look at what shapes make up this scene before moving into what makes up this environment. So for instance, we have various rock faces around here in red. We have some fallen rock in purple. We have some bushes and some smaller shrubs in light green, and then some trees in yellow with some water in blue. And we'll talk a little later about how we approach this stuff, but this could be texture variation, or it could actually be modelled or scattered. And it's up to you which one you use. It depends on how much time you have, how close you get to these objects, and which way is, quite frankly, easier. So when we're breaking down an environment, one thing we need to look for is variation. Of course, we can't create all the variation within nature, but we need to make sure that we do enough to add the richness our environment needs. And at a bare minimum, this would come in threes. It sounds like an arbitrary number, but really it's just the minimum amount of variation that you can get away with before you start to notice repetition. But we don't need to stick to 3. Really, we create as much as we feasibly can before we run out of memory or patience, whichever comes first. So this would apply to models first, and after breaking down what types of flora that we need, trees, bushes, shrubs and flowers, etc., we should try and find at least 3 different types of each of these. For instance, if it's trees, you might find that you need some birch trees, some alder trees and some Scots pine trees, and you would create 3 variations of each one of those trees. Now alongside this, the scale and the rotation, the translation and the colour randomisation is usually enough to achieve what we need. We should really pay close attention to the reference though, to make sure that it's informing all of our choices. So next up is grouping. And it's all well and good randomizing each asset, say in a grassy field or in a forest. But quite often it's how these elements bunch up that creates the reality. So taking a look at some forest first, you'll notice that breaking up the variation are usually groups of trees or colours, and within these patches of groups are further variations, and this adds a lot of richness to the scene. So here we have an example of just this grouping within a forest. But we can also observe it within rocks, and in this case, the groups add a lot of interest to the scene rather than just allowing everything to, blend into one rock face. On a grassy plain, you get the same idea. This time it's with smaller plants and shrubs. And within a forest, you might find that it's the flowers that really add it. And there are reasons behind this. We can talk about them a little later. But it's important to spot these within your scene and make sure that you're doing them justice in the final image. So just to jump back, one thing I want to mention before we move any further is scale, and it's really something that needs to be observed and respected. It will make your life a lot easier if you start to work in real world scale. This will not only save you time later, as correcting these scale issues later down the line is very annoying, but it also means that your light calculations within the scene will be correct, as these also work in real scale. Understanding is the final one I'll mention. Looking is one thing, but trying to understand why certain plants or trees or other flora or dressing exists in the way it does will not only create a much more believable image, but will also help you design your own when reference is lacking. On any new environment, it's worth looking into the geology of the land, the types of flora or plants that grow there, which patterns emerge when viewed from a distance, and what are the physical properties that give character to that particular environment. And this could be simple: trees not growing on certain angles or heights or proximities, more flora growing where water would build up, or rocks building up in certain areas. We have some tools at our disposal within Houdini to help us with this though, and we'll cover them later when we move on to scattering. On an asset level though, when analysing any object, as mentioned previously, I would start with the model and make sure that all the surfaces, dimensions and silhouettes match. It's important to constantly check the object from as many different angles as possible, and perhaps even switch between orthographic and perspective views to check the dimensions. This of course applies to any sculpting that's required. So texturing is, in my opinion, one of the hardest parts, especially if what you're texturing is supposed to be realistic. Since Substance Painter and Designer came along, this made the process a lot more fun, but also potentially a little bit more generic, and there is a real danger of abusing the procedural texturing tools in a thoughtless way. Again, it comes down to paying attention to the reference. Photogrammetry websites like Megascans, as is opened here, and textures.com help us a lot, as we can see what real scan textures look like on 3D geometry, which is an excellent resource. So if we look here, one of the things that you can do is, if you switch here to albedo, we start to understand exactly what type of textures make up a rock face, and it's an invaluable resource. If you ever need to sculpt your own rock face, I would definitely recommend opening up Megascans or textures.com and taking a look and seeing what the textures look like on real world photogrammetry objects. Finally, shading can be very simple from the distances in which we work when it comes to large scale environments. We should always be observing and studying from far away rather than too close up, in an attempt to be accurate but also optimized. And this ties back to the vague to detailed principle, as it deals with what things look like from far away as the primary objective. There are many things like fly-throughs that complicate this, But we can look at this in the Arnold shading settings section and render optimization. And that's all for analyzing reference. Thanks.